This is going to be an example of option A, how many horns. This part of the sound design program determines an appropriate quantity and type of horn for an area. There are many configurations usually that can be used to satisfy the paging coverage in an area. This will default to Valcom standard spacing. So I press A, and I just pressed enter to scroll through those first few screens. For this example, I'm going to put in an area's length of 160 feet and an area's width of 220 feet. I'm going to design for the horns to be mounted 18 feet high and for the noise level to be 60 dB SPL. Based on that, and this is just repeating what I put in, a length of 160 feet, a width of 220 feet, say combined square footage of 35,200 square feet, 18-foot mounting height, and 60 dB SPL ambient noise. Based on that, and based on my design criteria of no more than 26.86 dB over the ambient, actually what it used was just 24.61 dB over the ambient to stay within the 110-foot spacing limit, and a minimum dB of 6 dB SPL over the ambient for voice paging. Remember, for voice paging, you want the sound from the paging to be 6 dB above whatever your ambient noise level is. The ambient noise level is 60 dB SPL. The minimum sound from the paging in this room will be 66 dB SPL. Based on this, the program has selected horns that are adjusted to 94.85 dB SPL at 4 feet. That falls into the 5-watt category, so it's just stated that it's a 5-watt horn adjusted to this noise level, to this sound pressure level rather. And then based on the dimensions of the room and a horn adjusted to this output, you'd end up with 2 horns per row and 2 rows for a total of 4 horns. This sound level output from the horn at 4 feet ties directly to the maximum spacing of 110 feet, which is Valcom's standard spacing for a 60 dB SPL area. Okay? In other words, if you have a horn adjusted to 94.85 dB SPL at 4 feet, and it's mounted 18 feet in the air, then 110 horizontal feet directly in front of that horn, you'll have 6 dB SPL above the 60 dB SPL ambient. You'd have 66 dB. Okay? Again, it's designed for a maximum spacing of 110 feet. And what it's done here is it's taken that 110-foot maximum spacing, divided it into the dimensions. Okay? Well, 110 doesn't divide evenly into 160. You end up with 1 point something, so it rounded that up to 2, and you end up with 80-foot spacing. At 80-foot spacing, you actually have more than 6 dB above the ambient. Remember, your horn is turned up to accommodate 110-foot spacing. You're only going 80, so this is the actual sound level at the horn spacing. At the side-by-side spacing, however, it's taken the 110-foot dimension, divided it into 220, and it was an even division. So you have 110-foot spacing, and that gives you exactly 66 dB SPL. Notice that that is 6 dB above the 60 dB SPL ambient noise level. Suppose this room had columns that were 50 feet apart, and it would be more convenient to use 50-foot or 100-foot spacing. A couple ways I can evaluate this. I can either press plus and minus to increase and decrease the spacing by 1 foot at a time. Okay, so suppose I want to take this down to 100, I could just hit the minus key repeatedly until it gets down to 100 feet. Okay. Now it's set up for 100-foot spacing. Notice the number of horns increased as it would. I could also hit the plus key to increase the spacing, 1 foot at a time. Or an easier way is just on the numeric keypad on the computer keyboard, I could just put in 100, or I could put in 50. I don't have to press enter, and it'll adjust for that spacing. I could put in 93. Whatever I put in, it'll adjust for that spacing value. Okay. Several other options. If I just press enter here, I can press B to change my input data, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. I could press C to change to standard spacing if I'm outside of standard spacing at the moment. I can press D to evaluate maximum spacing, but this is for non-enclosed areas like outside areas only. If you change to maximum spacing for an inside area, you have a lot of danger of reverberation problems. If I've changed my configuration with B here, I could return to the initial configuration by pressing E. I could press F to change my minimum dB over the ambient to 6. If I press F, what I get is, to 3. If I press F, I get a tone-only configuration, and that means the minimum dB over the ambient would be 3, and my spacing could increase somewhat also. I could press G to view some more details about the configuration. I could press H to swap so that the rows are along the 160-foot dimension instead of the 220 feet. I could press I to print the configuration if my printer's set up. Let me press B, and I'm going to change the configuration a little bit. I'm going to change it so that it's 115 feet. I'm trying to get just a little bit above the 110-foot maximum spacing. So 115 feet, and let's go with 230 feet. I'm going to leave everything else the same. I could put in a desired spacing here, like if I had columns, but I'm just going to press Enter. Notice this time I get this option screen, which you see fairly often. What the program's doing is it's taken the data that you've given it, and it's come up with a standard spacing. In this case, it's 110-foot maximum suggested spacing. And it's divided the dimensions by 110 feet. And it came up with a number of horns per row and a number of rows. In this case, it's come up with 2 horn rows, and they'd only be 57.5-foot spacing. Although I could go up to 110 feet, 110 did not divide evenly into the dimension that I gave it. What it's saying is, if I use just one row, okay, it's only going to result in 115-foot spacing. That's only 5 feet over the 110. And it's asking me, do I want to exceed the standard spacing for this area and use one less row of horns? It's only going to offer you this option if the additional spacing, in this case the 5 feet over the 110-foot maximum, is negligible. In other words, if that extra footage would make a 1 dB or less difference in the sound pressure level. I'm going to press Y to accept that. Likewise, it evaluates the side-by-side horn spacing. Again, it's designing for 110 feet. It came up with a 2-point-something rows, and it's saying, well, officially we should use 3 horns per row, or horns per row. Officially we should use 3 horns per row, but that's going to give you 76.6-foot spacing. Well, that's well within the 110 feet. And that's telling you, but if you only use 2 horns per row, of course you'll end up with less horns in the room, and it's only going to exceed spacing, again, in this case, by 5 feet. So I'm going to press yes to accept that. It's warning me that I'm outside the 110-foot maximum spacing. Okay, it's designed for 115 feet instead of 110. Okay, it's warning me that if the area is reverberant, I might not want to do this. Right, but I did end up with just 2 total horns, which is 2 horns per row times 1 row. I'm going to press B again, right from this screen. I'm just going to scroll through. This time I'm not going to accept the recommendations. I'm just going to press Enter instead of pressing Y. And again, I'm going to press Enter. Notice that we went from 2 horns to 6 horns. And that's just to stay within the 110-foot maximum spacing. Much better to go with 115 feet and have 2 horns. So that's what that option screen is all about. I'm going to press Enter, and I'm going to press X to exit.